Come Thursday this week, we mark precisely 1 month since Russia's invasion of Ukraine that has, among other devastating realities, led to much uncertainty within the global economic arena. For more, I have Professor Oh Jun-seok from Sookmyung Women's University. Professor Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure.
I also have Professor Yang Hee-dong from Ewha Women's University. Welcome back, Professor Yang.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right, Professor Oh, Russia recently forestalled a potential default by making a $117 million payment to foreign bond holders. But I hear the danger of a default remains high this year.
Yeah, right. In 1998, Russia deported a local currency debt at that time and then declared a moratorium. Russia can decide its own selection at that time. But now the situation is different because it is a foreign currency debt and the situation is totally different. Even though the Russia wants to pay the interest rate payment, but the situation is Russia cannot access to the international settlement system. So it is not easy for the investors to receive the interest payment. And then in case Russia doesn't pay the coupon interest in dollars, then the creditor would have the right to declare default. Russia's finance minister said that the London branch of paying the agent Citibank has received, as you mentioned, that $117 billion in total payment, while Russia seems to have been able to meet this coupon payment in full, but Moscow wants to, and then wants to show their ability to pay its international debt, but it must be tested again and again. That's because more payments are coming soon, and then much larger $2 billion worth of payment is scheduled for early April. It could create even bigger headache for Moscow. That is because the fund that used to make a payment comes from Russia's frozen foreign currency, which is sanctioned now. So it is what I'm saying that it is very unclear whether the investor really received their money or not. So JP Morgan estimates that Russia had about $40 billion worth of foreign currency debt as of last year, with about half of that held by foreign investors. So a potential default would be bad news for Russia, lacking access to the international finance, and then Russia will lose the investment grade ratings. But it is that the global market probably not that much get hurt from the Russia's default.
Right, hopefully though.
Hopefully.
Professor Yang, what more can you tell us about the potential broader repercussions of Russia defaulting on its government debt?
Well, as Professor Oh already mentioned, we should distinguish between moratorium and default. Default means that Russia will decline to pay any interest or loans, whereas moratorium means they want to delay the payment. So, and also there are the big differences in those two time periods, 1998 and at the moment, because in 1998, they had this very serious economic problems because Soviet Union had just been dissolved, and Asian countries who had suffered from a lack of the foreign currencies could not purchase the oil from Russia. But now the current problem is absolutely diplomatic and political issue. Well, at the moment, the Russian exposure of Korean banks amount to $1.4 billion. That takes only 1.4% out of the Russian exposure owned by the global banks. Now, the Russian exposure amounts to $1.5 billion, and 75% of overall Russian exposure is owned by 4 major countries, such as France, Italy, United States, and Austria. So if Russia declares default or moratorium, which is very unlikely, then I should say that there should be a very limited impact in Korean economy. But European countries, and particularly European countries, may have different story.
Right, and talking about the Korean economy, Professor Oh, given the uncertainties in light of Kremlin's war in Ukraine, Moody's has lowered Korea's growth outlook for this year to 2.7%. But authorities here in the country have vowed to secure a 3.1% economic growth this particular year. What are your prospects?
Because due to the rising uncertainties, the global and then the domestic economy is surrounded by a totally uncertainty. So therefore, I agree with the downward revision of economic growth with a range of less than 3% and just above 2.5%, because Korean economy should have been affected very negatively afterward. And the price of energy and raw material, this is very important for Korean economy. It composes of the cost of production, and this kind of price is rising, and the price of agriculture is rising, and then eventually interest rates is rising. This is the situation that Korea have to face. When the price of input or a factor of production rise, it is called the cost push inflation. Cost push inflation would trigger chain reaction of the decreasing production, decreasing investment, and then as a result, decreasing the level of employment, and finally, at the level of consumption, decrease in the market. So when it triggers this kind of vicious cycle, then the economy goes into the trap of stagflation. It is very, I might say that it is very imminent and then vulnerable to the risk of the stagflation. And then as for the inflationary pressure, the soaring prices because of one of the factors might be increased liquidity due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But the external factors like Russia-Ukraine crisis, it is unavoidable. It is totally unavoidable risk. And more than anything else, if the crude price breaks the $130 mark, this year's consumer price is expected to reach just 4%. 4%. So in addition, red alarm is on the foreign exchange rate. Weakening currency means that it will boost up the inflation because so we procure the raw material and energy as an import. So when the Korean won depreciate and the value of import increase, so the sourcing cost of production will soar up. The next administration might face these kind of challenges, and then they have to keep balance between controlling money supply and then maintaining stability in the market, which is far from the populism.
Right. It would be a daunting task, of course, for the new incoming administration. Professor Yang, Moody's has also claimed that Korea will be affected by disruptions in the supply of key material needed within its semiconductor and automobile industries. Having said that, what can be done to address this upcoming reality?
Well, that is a big concern actually in our economy, because Jerome Powell, this chairperson of the FRB, already declared that the current problem with the war between Russia and Ukraine may cause big disruptions in global supply chains. Well, the manufacturing is a major driver for Korean economy, and there are many critical natural resources that may help work as ingredients for our manufacturing facilities. And we have very high dependency on Russia for many natural resources. For example, we purchase the neon and xenon, etc., for semiconductors, and lithium, nickel for the automobile, the secondary batteries, and naphtha for petrochemicals, and parasilicon for steel industry. The major problem for all these natural resources is, first, Russia has very high market share. So it's really tough for Korean manufacturing firms to find out an alternative, the importing sources. Secondly, the price of all these natural resources have increased almost like by 40% and 50% this year. And the third problem with this one is, we do not have any predefined established strategy to deal with all this, the abruptions. For example, you may heard the resource diplomacy that was started in the government of Kim Dae-jung and inherited by Roh Moo-hyun and the Lee Myung-bak. But all of a sudden, this government had canceled all these plans. So we should recover these plans, because it really helps to find out the alternative sources of all these critical natural resources.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor, global oil prices have been rallying amid the uncertainty over in Ukraine, and this reality itself looks to hamstring economic expansion. Right. What are your thoughts on this?
As Professor Yang commented about, it's time to think about the energy diplomacy. And then I think that increasing trend of this kind of energy will continue even after the Russian-Ukraine crisis. And Goldman Sachs raised its 2022 Brent crude spot price forecast to $135 a barrel, which is from a previous outlook of $98. So it is a high jump compared to the previous year, the steepest pace since the oil shock in 1970s. Just as it takes 3 to 4 weeks of fluctuation in the global crude oil prices to be reflected in the domestic energy prices, so the increase in this kind of energy price is likely to hit the domestic market might be early April. So then the inflation among consumer prices quickening faster than expected, and the inflationary pressure the Korean economy will face might be tougher and tougher as time goes. And the price rise last month was 3.7% from a year earlier, well over the central bank's target rate of 2%. And the speed of this kind of oil price hike will be lessened because Korea decided to release 4.4 million barrels of oil from the emergency reserves to help stabilize the energy prices. Even though it is a minimal effect, but the government also tried to extend the fuel tax cut by 3 months. In spite of this, the country's manufacturing industries rely heavily on the imports for energy, and the nation only returned to a trade surplus in February after two months trade deficit caused by energy prices. So once again, as Professor Yang commented about, it is very important for Korean economy to think about made a kind of supplement to alternative way of sourcing the energies.
Right, and staying with the concerns raised by Professor Yang, this is the million-dollar question. What preparations do you propose to better prepare, perhaps, for a prolonged conflict then over in Ukraine?
Well, I can think about a couple of very, their parallel approaches. First one is about diplomacy. The Russia is very likely to, approach China to, get more weapons or to recover their economic damages. So, but that there's a very serious tension between China and the United States. And from the geological, locations, we cannot take only one side, at random. So we should take a very, very sincere and very serious, the compromise between, China and the United States, even in dealing with this, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Secondly, when it comes to the economic situations, many people are talking about the impact of the oil problems in the world market, but our dependency on Russian oil, which is only 5%. United States has 8%, whereas European countries has different story. They have up to 25% for depending on Russia for the oil import. So the more serious problem in our case, again, is on natural resources. So we should work very hard to find out the alternative sources and setting up the new strategy and the government or institutions to explore the real new natural minerals and resources in overseas, etc. So those are a couple of very, very critical steps for our government.
Right, we need to diversify our market then.
Exactly.
Professor O, the US Federal Reserve on Monday spoke about the need to adopt an aggressive monetary policy to tame inflation. How does this stance look to affect the financial market, do you think? As Sonny commented about, the U.S. Fed Chair Jerome Powell announced the interest rate increase by 25 basis points. The rate increase is within the market's expectation. It is not a surprise, but Powell added that the Fed is prepared to move more aggressively if inflation continues to build up. In addition, the Fed lowered its U.S. GDP growth projection for this year to 2.8% from the previous forecast of 4%.
Go back to the response of the financial market in Korea. Bank of Korea moved with reference rate by 25 basis point this January. And in February and March, Bank of Korea do not increase the interest rate. There are many reasons, but according to the finance theory, the so-called interest rate parity theorem, interest gap between two countries should be kept in any situation, if not the capital flight from one country to the other country happen. Think about it, when the US increased the interest rate, but the Bank of Korea do not change the interest rate, the interest gap might be widened. So in that case, that the capital movement from one country to the other happen. So in a way to avoid this kind of situation, there is no other choice for Bank of Korea to increase or step up consecutively the interest rate. And then might be those kind of hike deferred to the April. And then I might say that in May, there must be kind of sharp increase of interest rate increase in Korea. And then financial outlook remains very uncertain. A potential debt default by Russia could result in a global liquidity squeeze, which triggers capital withdrawal from emerging market, including Korea, to other countries. And then investors took a wait-and-see attitude stemming from the hope for progress in the peace talk between Russia and Ukraine. But we already know that at this time of uncertainty, investors always pay attention to the short-term profit-taking strategy.
Right. Mm-hmm. And staying with the same issue, Professor Yang, what more can you tell us about the potential impact of further rate hikes by the US Federal Reserve on the monetary policy direction of Korea's central bank?
Well, we should understand that the major driver for the FRB's decision to increase the base rate is on inflation. In February, the United States has the highest CPI increase, 7.9%, which is the worst and biggest the inflation in the last 40 years. And last month in Korea, we had a CPI increase by 3.7%, which is the highest after 2011. So, we have new president, and he will absolutely appoint a new leader, chair of, the Korean Bank. And we also have the special committee organized, chaired by the chairperson to determine the new base rate. And many people assume that the United States, the FRB, will increase the base rate up to 1.9%, which is also declared by Jerome Powell by the end of this year. And next year, through three more meetings, the interest will increase up to about 2.5 or 2.7. That means our interest will be a little higher than the FRB to lock up the current currencies, foreign currencies in Korean market. So by the end of this year, the base rate will move up to the 2%. And next year, many people are really concerned that our base rate will even go farther to 3%. So that is very, very pessimistic, the forecasting for this year and next year's best interest.
Right, I see. And Professor, are there any other risk factors to economic stability that we need to keep an eye on?
All right. I might say there are some external factors. We have to pay attention to three factors. More than anything else, top priority might be the progress of peace talk between Russia and Ukraine, which is the source of uncertainty now. And then it is a kind of string with the inflationary pressure and interest rate hike expectation and so on. But the second thing we have to pay attention to is the China. Because China is the #1 trade partner of Korea, but nowadays Chinese economy is not that good. I mean that stagnant pace. And then in spite of this, that China might take a step to support Russia economically or politically, then which might trigger severe consequences for Korean potentially to export in China. And the last thing we have to think about it is the movement of Japanese yen. Because at this situation between the EU and Russia, the US and China, The capital market is inundated with total uncertainties. At this time, relatively speaking, for the time being, that Japanese yen might be reported as a safe harbor for the capital investors. So in a sense, that the Japanese yen might be the final destination for global investors, kind of what I'm saying, the risk managing tool.
So you're proposing that I should be buying the yen? Professor Yang, finally, what words of advice would you like to share with the incoming administration as it seeks to take the reins of the country this May?
Well, I should recommend to diversify the sourcing of natural resources, because the manufacturing is a major driver for our economy, and all these critical resources take up to 75% of the major costs and prices of our finished goods. So, for example, there are 3,000 natural resources, through which we depend on 80% of the import. And China is a major country, that we have a high dependency on importing all those natural resources. Well, we already had a similar experience before, through the trade conflict with Japan for parts, equipment, and also urea problems from Japan to fuel your automobiles. So we should strengthen our internal capabilities to produce all those natural ingredients, and also we should diversify, right, the sourcing of those materials. So that should be critical advice I want to give to the new government.
Right, all right then, Professor Yang, thank you as always for your words. Professor Oh, thank you for being with us today.